The arc of Sansa Stark is certainly fascinating. At the start of the series, she is naive and rather sheltered, believing in old songs and chivalry. It's only at the end of season 1, after her beloved Joffrey orders the execution of her father, does she begin to question such beliefs. Over the course of 8 seasons, Sansa becomes more realistic, harsh, and less of a romantic character. Whilst doing this, she gains more agency and power. From this, it's difficult to not discern a clear message, or at least an implication. The way to grow up and to gain power, particularly political power, is by destroying romantic notions of chivalry, knighthood, and honour. Game of Thrones always defined itself, as well as A Song of Ice and Fire, the books the series was based on, by being above the romanticism of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. All things considered, Game of Thrones is fantasy for the postmodern age, where we are suspicious and sceptical of grand romanticism. When Ned, Robb, and Catelyn die, this averts the trope of the good, honourable royal family living happily ever after. If Sansa Stark is to survive the Game of Thrones and even win it, she must sacrifice much of who she is during season 1. It's pretty clear. Game of Thrones is no fan of chivalry. But does Game of Thrones have the correct stance on it? In this video, I will consider medieval history and literature, as well as the broader context of chivalry, particularly in the 21st century. Some questions I'll deal with include whether we should return to it, or if it oppresses women. Although this video is centered around Game of Thrones, I will reference the Grimm brothers, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and many chivalric romances to add greater context into discussions of chivalry. I'm Madeleine Rose Jones, and I help you understand the world through fiction. Subscribe for videos about history, literature, and culture. Part 1. Does chivalry even exist? There's a clear difference between chivalry as a belief and chivalry as a practice. It's all well and good to say you value chivalry, but if your actions don't mirror that, then it's kind of hollow. Of course, men, especially knights and soldiers, are capable of both good and evil actions. I interpret chivalry as an ideal, something ordinary citizens, whether a soldier or a lady, strive towards. This is true when considering medieval literature. The chivalric romances, such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or in Chrétien de Troyes' Lancelot, were written in an age not immune from warfare. Some medieval romances, especially near the end of the Middle Ages, took a fantastical turn, as shown in the La Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. The point is, chivalric romances are an exaggeration of typical human behaviour and environment. Of course, a meatier question remains. Can men act as chivalric knights, especially towards women? This is obviously a contentious issue, especially among medieval French historians. But I see it in contemporary history being a controversy as well. For example, if you study World War II, it's kind of hard to believe in the notion of chivalric knights, especially if you discuss the Pacific Theatre in China or the fall of Berlin under the Soviet Union. This causes our notion of chivalric knights to fade. Before I continue, I just want to mention that there were good men fighting in World War II and I from many countries. This isn't me saying that all soldiers are bad or all knights are evil, because I really do not believe that, and I'd like to make that clear. There's a reason why, after World War I, a movement arose across Europe for tombs of unknown soldiers, because we respect and understand that a soldier or knight has sacrificed and risked a lot, and in some cases, actually in many cases, their lives. On a side note, if you are ever in London, pay a visit to Westminster Abbey. You'll see the tomb of the unknown warrior, and frankly, many other wartime memorials. There are similar statues and memorials in France and the United States of America. To me, soldiers and knights are worthy of respect. Of course, not every one of them is. And I can see why some struggle with chivalric romances. Because the ideas of mercy, loyalty, wisdom, and courage are not present in all. During the late Middle Ages, many knights robbed and looted churches, picked on defenseless peasants and travellers, as well as engaging in sexual violence and murder. But if anything, this decay in knightly behaviour from some may have fueled the demand and production of chivalric romances. I also don't want to typecast all writers of chivalric romances. Some were interested in propaganda or affluence, arguing for a monarchy or a certain type of social status. But some writers were more clever and wove in clever critiques and praises of British society, such as Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. A problem with much discussions of chivalry is, well, missing the point. No author is saying that the Middle Ages were a time of perfect chivalry, with knights and roses and Camelot. As much as I love those romanticised paintings from the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, it's important, crucial, to understand that the Middle Ages consisted of people with everyday problems, as well as strengths and flaws. Those who wrote, read, promoted, and funded chivalric romances during the Middle Ages would have had some experience or connection with warfare, even if they weren't combatants. In a curious way, some chivalric romances came from a place of tragedy or pain. This is quite explicit, I find, in France, which, depending on the region, experienced a fair amount of bloodshed in the late Middle Ages. It's also worth noting that many of our notions of chivalry actually don't come from the Middle Ages. In the 18th and 19th century, so we're entering modern history now, that's when the influx of writings about chivalry emerge. You also saw this in the visual arts with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Imagery of chivalric knights and virtuous women appeared. Now, I quite like this movement and I have a lot of respect for it. But a downside is that it contributed to the misconception that the Middle Ages were an idealized time of chivalry. And I understand why this occurs. During the Enlightenment, it was promoted that the idea that the Middle Ages were regressive, superstitious, and completely barbaric. But I wonder if the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood are also missing the point about history as well. Part 2. Does chivalry oppress women? One serious accusation about chivalry is that it oppresses women. This comes from a long trend of fairy tales, royalty culture, and romances being deemed sexist. To that, I'll always note that the biggest patrons of chivalric romances in the Middle Ages and Renaissance were women. Likewise, in romance and royalty reading circles today, a vast majority of scholars and readers are women. I'd go as far to say that most romance groups are quite female dominated. Clearly, women have an interest in romance and chivalry. But this doesn't mean it's not oppressive, or that there is no harm. As mentioned earlier, there were knights and soldiers who committed vast acts of evil against women and girls. This controversy is also reflected in the arc of Sansa Stark. In much of the earlier seasons, Her encounters with the opposite sex, such as Joffrey, end up negative and abusive. Even with Loras Tyrell, who she is romantically inclined towards for a bit in Season 3, is kind of played for laughs. Sansa, due to her romantic and idealistic nature, can't pick up on Loras's sexuality. Although Sandor Clegane and Tyrion Lannister are quite kind and helpful towards Sansa, there's always a guise of her being too naive or too kind for the monstrous land called King's Landing. This is a sharp and interesting contrast to Cersei and Marjorie, who are more scheming, more manipulative, more realistic, and therefore more sensible than Sansa. Of course, there is some truth to this. If one is more aware and alert to their surroundings, they can avoid danger and thrive. It's also worth noting that every encounter Sansa has with Marjorie or Cersei, they hold the power. I can't stop shaking the notion that Game of Thrones goes well above this to destroy Sansa's core self in Season 1. Certain key lines such as, "I don't pray anymore," or "I'm a stupid little girl," cement the errors of Sansa's former thinking. When Sansa eventually learns to play the Game of Thrones, she loses her romantic energy. She no longer develops crushes, and although it's for a very understandable reason, I can certainly see Sansa arguing that things like romance, faith, chivalry, hope, and honour are all foolish and silly to have. There's an underlying implication that the only way Sansa can become a strong leader is if she abandons chivalry in favour of constant realism and cynicism. So, was Sansa oppressed by chivalry? Yes and no. It's obvious that a significant portion of Sansa's suffering in the early books comes from shattered expectations. Eddard Stark, or commonly Ned Stark, who, like Sansa, was prone to romantic chivalry, did not adequately prepare Sansa for King's Landing. In the first novel, Sansa is so caught up in a romantic fantasy with Joffrey that she ends up telling Cersei about Ned's plans. Likewise, she excuses Joffrey's bad behaviour at the King's Road with his princely status. All of this certainly argues that chivalry is oppressive, but this is a very cynical, worst-case scenario take. We must remember that chivalry is meant to inspire and motivate the reader to certain ideals and mannerisms, whether male or female. What I gathered after reading many chivalric romances is the urge to be the best version of yourself. And I think that's a very positive message. Unfortunately, Game of Thrones never really picks up on this. George R. R. Martin and the showrunners have a dismissive attitude towards chivalry, preferring a tough realism. It's a very 21st century outlook about history, and although it's in vogue, I disagree with it. Sansa can still have her wits and intelligence, with a good heart and chivalric spirit. Game of Thrones prides itself on subverting Lord of the Rings, and I get that, but in its quest to stand out, George R. R. Martin gives a rather simplistic account of chivalry. It's also a humourless account. When reading many romances, especially Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I was taken aback by the use of absurd humour, with exaggeration and fantastic elements. Some chivalric romances deal with quite adult themes too. Game of Thrones takes its pride in a serious tone, but it makes a mistake. This tone is gained through sex, violence, and death. But many chivalric romances already have this too. Even Arthurian romances had tragedy, as seen in Tristan and Isolde. So, despite Sansa and George R. R. Martin's perspective on chivalry, it's possible to have a sophisticated approach towards it. Overall, chivalric romances encourage both men and women to become better versions of themselves, and I don't find that to be an oppressive message. Part 3. Return and Nostalgia. No discussion of chivalry is complete without considering nostalgia. From my observation, quite a number of young men and women ask for a return to chivalry, or at the very least, old-fashioned courtship. This is quite apparent if you move to the further right on the political scale and in conservative movements. For those in that group, you may be familiar with a magazine called Evie, which is aimed at young conservative women. There's definitely an essence of old school dating, where a man always proposes or pays on date. This may appear old-fashioned or even sexist to some, but personally it's evidence of frustration at the current dating, marriage and courtship scene. Regardless of whether someone blames feminism or social media, this doesn't change the problem from existing. However, I must caution against excessive nostalgia. Even if we return to old school courtship and dating, this won't change the inherent nature of humanity. The women and men who act manipulative, gross, and abusive will still exist under a nostalgic system. So often, the argument for chivalry is treating it like a fix-all solution, and I don't think that works. I also take issue when chivalry is used to overly idealize the opposite sex. It's foolish and quite harmful for men to view women as constantly pure, virtuous maidens who are naive. Likewise, women shouldn't view men in such black and white terms either. Even though I dislike aspects of Sansa's arc, George R. R. Martin is correct to point out that overtly romanticized chivalry can hurt women and girls like Sansa. However, it's possible to appreciate chivalric romances and fairy tales without giving into this notion. You must view writers such as the Grimm brothers through the lenses of archetypes and idealized symbolism, not as a realistic guide into human behavior. This is a wider problem with grimdark fantasy, as it treats symbolism, fable, legend, and mythology as hard concrete facts worthy of scorn or derision. But the truth is more subtle. I don't think Game of Thrones ever quite grasped it.